long. Because the next speaker has a lot to say and has a lot that he can say about his friend, his brother, his partner, the last of the Mohicans, brother. Welcome, Prime Minister Ralph Gonsales.
Mr. Chairman, my dear comrade, the Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and members of Cabinet and Parliament and party activists, those who former parliamentarians, Your Excellencies, members of the family and the media, I'm very happy to be here this evening. As you know, not too long from now, there would be another heavyweight championship fight in St. Vincent and the Grenadines sometime before the end of the year. And only a few things could get me away from the battle. And as everybody knows, that I love elections, especially when you're winning them. I have a long paper written because I wanted to structure my own thoughts about Rosie. But I wouldn't read the paper. I will speak from the head and from the heart. No, he was my dear friend and comrade. I loved him very much. And that love was returned. I became a member of the Douglas family through my relations with Mike and Olive and Rosie and of course Sister Pat, who worked in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as a member of the Clooney sisters, St. Joseph of Clooney. And of course, the younger generation. And Tiani will tell you that I have been speaking to him for quite a while, as he correctly said. Any of Rosie's children, any of the family, I can't be too busy for them. And he would tell you that with the Labour family, you may stray a little, but we always have a place for homecoming. Always have a place for homecoming. And in this Labour family, if we have problems, we deal with them inside. We don't allow vanities to take us in any warring outside. Because at the end of the day, what has brought progress to the working people in the Caribbean, in Dominica, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is solidarity. We must never forget that. The other matter which we must remember, and I will come to Rosie in some good remembrances, we have a number of persons whom we educate. The working people have made tremendous sacrifices for them. And many of them think that they are bright. And they are indeed bright. And that the education which they receive is their birthright and as a consequence of their brightness. Well, there are a lot of bright people before this generation, and they never had the opportunities. And the opportunities are created through solidarity. And insofar as brightness goes, there are two kinds of brightness. Brightness which illuminates and a brightness which blinds. If you're driving your SUV on high beam and you're coming to me and I'm driving my SUV on high beam, we're so bright we can't see one another. We only have brightness in solidarity with one another. The Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey, National Hero of Jamaica, and arguably the most significant political leader among black people in the diaspora in the 20th century, very much influenced Rosie. He wrote and spoke repeatedly on a theme about working together, which is what Rosie was about. Marcus Garvey said, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. And in going far together, you will find out that you go faster than if you go alone. In the 1930s, in the anti-colonial uprisings, the working people and the peasantry, most did not finish primary school. But yet, they were the ones who accepted what their nationalists and labor leaders told them, that we must have universal secondary education, that we must have a University of the West Indies. They didn't finish primary school. And it is that pressure through the social democratic revolution, which had its beginnings in the 1930s, that the University of the West Indies was formed, was created, was established in 1948. If it were not for the University of the West Indies, I would not have gone to university in 1966. And the University of the West Indies would not have been created but for the solidarity among the working people and the peasantry. So my life, Rosie's, our lives made and molded in solidarity. And I have found, and Rosie found, the strongest allies, the most reliable people are the poor, the working people, and the peasantry. And in order to know how the whole thing runs, we had to ask our mothers and our fathers and our grandparents. But we also have to ask our daughters and our sons. What is the purpose of asking how the whole thing run? The purpose is to make a whole daughter and a whole son. Not a perfect daughter, not a perfect son. A whole daughter and a whole son. Out of the compromise that the fever of history has made us. And in order to do so, we have to come home to ourselves. And in coming home to ourselves, we must have the realization that though we are not better than anybody else, nobody is better than us. These are foundations of Rosie Douglas. Simple, straightforward, but profound in their meaning and their implications. And he learned about these things through life and living. From observations, from working with people, from reading, studying, and building organizations. We can talk about Rosie in 5 different phases. Growing up in Dominica from the time of his birth in 1941 until he left here in 1960-61. Then we can look at the second phase of his life, the Canada years. The third phase, from 1976 when he came back, brought back in chains, to 1992 when he became leader of the Dominica Labour Party. And there's the period, the fourth period, 1992, until the year 2000 when he became Prime Minister. And the 8 months, the fifth phase, is when he actually served as Prime Minister. But to understand Rosie, in addition to understanding the personality, we have to understand the context in every single set of circumstances in which he lived and which he was molded to know this man. There's a great writer in the middle of the 19th century called Karl Marx. In a very famous book called The 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, it is very strange to find any leader anywhere in the world quoting Marx. Everybody run away from Marx as if you're a zombie running from holy water. You don't have to accept Marx's programmatic position in his manifesto of 1848, which grew out of particular European conditions. But everybody has something to teach you if you're willing to open your minds to learn. Marx said something which was confirmed by C.L.R. James, Trinidad intellectual, perhaps the most towering intellectual in the Caribbean from the 20th century, who also big influence on Rosie Douglas. In his famous analysis of what he called the Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, published that book in 1938. And he makes the same point that Marx made in the middle of the 19th century. Men and women make history, but only to the extent that the circumstances of history permit them so to make. They do not make history in circumstances chosen by themselves, but by circumstances inherited from the past and those which have emerged at the time of their life and living and production. And part of the circumstances are the ideas in the heads of men and women, which oftentimes weigh like a nightmare on their brains. You can't judge Rosie outside of his context and outside of his times. You can't judge Skerrit outside of the context of his times. Real life, living and production take place now. But it takes place from a historical process and matters which emerged. When I begin by telling you, you have to know how the whole thing runs. And you have to ask your parents and your grandparents and your daughter and your son. And the purpose of it is to make a whole daughter and a whole son. Not a perfect one. Out of the compromise that history has made all of us. Doesn't mean we have to be compromising about fundamental principles. So, there are some persons in a particular context will be accommodated by that context, and they do not wish to challenge anything in it. Not Rosie. You always wanted to see the amelioration, the betterment of humanity. Peace and justice and shared prosperity. And to live the life that he has lived, Rosie must have found resonance in what the prophet Jeremiah reported to us. What did he report to us? Before you were in your mother's womb, I knew you. I made you. I blessed you. I sanctified you. I set you apart. And I proclaim you prophet to all nations. He had a sense of mission. God make some people for certain times. But the times in which you live oftentimes constrain you while you push against what you do not like. And Rosie, like Issachar, one of the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. You read the book of Chronicles. There's a description of each of the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. But about Issachar, it is simply said, he knew the times and he acted accordingly. And Rosie was a visionary who came to understand the necessity and the desirability to address practical things in the here and the now. I am of the view that if Rosie was born in Roseau, that he would not have been the politician that he has come, that we come to know him. The sturdy rural values shaped him. The community spirit, the people-centeredness of his life and living, the instinctive love which the workers on his father's plantation showed to him and he showed to them. Yet at the same time understanding that there were occasions, he must have felt it, that on the estate there would have been exploitation. He himself rebelled against part of that. I don't think that RB would have approved of that, but you'd have understood. Because despite their differences, and of course their subsequent reconciliation, they loved each other. And Rosie learned what a strong person must be like from his father. And even as his father could not comprehend certain things that he had set upon for his own life, he loved and admired his son Rosie. Life possesses multiple interconnected contradictions. The important issue is how they are resolved. Now, I think the second matter for Rosie, apart from the issue of that community spiritedness and that connectedness with people living and working for one another. And I understand it very well too, because I'm a boy from the country. And I knew that if I were born in Kingston, the capital city, I would not have been the person I am. Not saying anything against the rural life. I mean the urban life. No. I'm talking about how you're molded for particular purposes. And Rosie also loved nature. You have to if you grow up in the country. The rivers, the seas, the mountains, the flora and the fauna, plants, the animals. And you feel a connectedness that while you eat from them and have an interaction with them, with nature, you're required to protect it and preserve it for the next generation. These are lessons. Who all here from Portsmouth? Put up your hand, let me see you. All right. And as the Rasta man say, Jehovah's what I talking about. Anybody here from Tatan? What about Pebush? Representative from Pebush is here. Yes, yes. The youngest one. Youngest one in the Labour family in Parliament. Magnificent child of God. Now, important too, in growing up in the rural areas, is that of family. Family is important. I want to say to you, you find out how family is important when you reach 60 going on 65. If you ain't have a family which close to you and helping you, you better get plenty money. Because if you ain't got no money and you ain't got no family, you're on your way to the poorhouse. So remember family. I'm talking verities of Rosie Douglas, you know. That's why it wasn't so easy to pigeonhole him ideologically. And I'll tell you where the wellspring comes from. I'll tell you where the wellspring comes from. I know him well because we spent a lot of time together. In those days too, when we traveled and we sleep in the same bed. In those days, two men, grown men sleeping in the same bed, there's nothing wrong in that. because in the popular discourse, to be gay was to be happy. It has a different meaning now. No. And the importance instilled, well, throughout all the communities, urban and rural, the importance of education. And that is why Labour parties, one of the reasons why Labour parties attracted such tremendous support. You know, in the early days, in every one of these countries, when the Labour leaders went to Parliament and talked about universal primary education, the planters and the commercial elite in the parliaments, you know what they said? If you educate everybody, who would walk the land? Huh? Without understanding that you just don't need strength to walk land. You need brains to walk land too, like any other activity. And the small farmers know that. Because they learn it from their experiences and from the Hebrew people. And in learning with your work attitudes, good work attitudes, you know he who watcheth the wind will not reap. He who gazeth at the rain will never sow. You try one thing in the morning, and if it ain't work, you try another thing in the evening, because you never sure which one will work. These are things which farmers learn in the rural areas, which we learn and we know about instinctively. And we also know that we have to be learning more and more things in order to improve our lives and living. Rosie also, and in the rural community, Rosie was a Christian believer. some of you who knew him well would not know this. Oh, he was tall and handsome and strong and charming. And women loved him much. But that never took him away from fundamental Christian beliefs. You know, I'll tell you something, and the Cuban ambassador is here, and I'll make the comparison. In December 2013, I went to see the Holy Father, Pope Francis. And we were inside the Sanctum Sanctorum talking for about 2 hours. Shooting the breeze. A Caribbean man and a Latin American one. And I said to him, I asked him, I said, Holy Father, what do you think of Fidel? Meaning Fidel Castro. Those who know the Latin Americans, you ask them a question which they have been pondering, and they have come to a conclusion. They look at you, they squint, they move their hand over the face. This is what the Holy Father did now. Put it under his chin. Look up and down. Don't answer me yet. And then pointed his finger at me. He said, I consider Fidel to be a believer. And he proceeded to give me chapter and verse as to why he thought that Fidel was a believer. Of course, about 2 months later, I went to Havana and I told Raul, his brother, and Raul, who is a humorous man, said to me, well, you know, Ralph, Pope Francis is a Jesuit. And the Jesuits have been known to get it wrong sometimes. But I believe Pope Francis and not Raul in this. And Raul gave me, from his experience with a Jesuit principal of his school, why he got it, some things wrong, you know. But you look at Rosie's life, you look at his work. There was a steadfastness to certain propositions, which you find in chapter 25 of the book of Matthew. I know you all came here tonight not expecting some of this what I'm talking about. I knew him well. And I knew his innermost thoughts. I knew him and talked to him in the dead of night when nobody is around, in solitude. And he will bare his soul to me and I to him, as two comrades who love each other and who in this struggle through life and through death. And I'd say, just by the way, one of the reasons why I continue at the age of 79, I'm 20 years older than when Rosie died. More than 20 years. And I pray that I continue much of the work what Rosie and I spoke about and not leave behind any unfinished task. I know the press don't usually hear politicians talk like how I'm talking tonight. Go home tonight and study. Read chapter 25 of the book of Matthew. It has 3 dimensions which you find in Rosie's work, central to Rosie's work. The first is the parable, well, the story about the wise and the foolish virgins. They were all looking for husbands. This is a story Christ is speaking, as recorded by Matthew. He made the point that those who put oil in the lamp and keep the fire burning were the ones who got the prize, who got the husband. Well, it may come to you simply that you put, as we sing it, we sing the Sankey, put a little oil in your lamp, keep it burning. Put a little oil in your lamp, I say. You know what that means? You have to plan. That's the first thing. That's putting the oil in the lamp about planning. First thing. The second story in the book of Matthew 25 is the parable of the talents. And the proposition which arises from the parable of the talents is from him according to his ability, to each according to his work. What you have, what ability you have. Talent referred to there was talents, the money, but it refers to talents generally. You must make use of these talents. Don't hide them under a bushel. Make use of them. And for your reward, you get in accordance with what you put out. It has to be fair and it has to be just. But what it tells you, you have to make use of your talent. That's why God don't like lazy people. These things are fundamental, you know. If you have them in you, through the changing scenes of life, through all the vicissitudes of life, they stay with you. And when you don't get the fair and just reward, that's when some people like Rosie and myself come by and say it has to be just. It has to be fair. And the third proposition in the book of Matthew is a story about separating the sheep from the goats. This is the one now about caring. To keep, if your brother is hungry, you have to help to provide something. Thirsty, if your son is in prison, you go and visit. The person's sick, you have to try and help. And that is where labor parties come in. But remember, you have to plan and you have abilities, you have to use them, you have to work. Because you ain't got nothing to share for the poor unless we produce or we work in solidarity with others external to us, our friends and allies, to help us. Now tonight, we are remembering Rosie in the best possible way. You know, the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, in a very fascinating book called the Peloponnesian Wars, in which he recounted a funeral oration of Pericles. The point was that when the young Greeks came back from war, to be sure, it was a requisite that they be memorialized in marble and in stone. And we have to give Rosie his due in that. But the most important memorial is in the hearts and minds of a grateful people, which we pass on from generation to generation. Most important. Rosie went to primary school in Portsmouth and dealing with first phase. And he came to town, Roseau. He went to St. Joseph Academy. He went to grammar school. He played cricket. They gave him a good basic colonial education. But he rebelled about the limitations of that colonial education. And as he growing up, he loved fishing and hunting, and he loved cricket. He had some modest skills in it. And he always loved cricket, which is important to remember in the totality of the human being. He also, remember, we are all men and women, real flesh and blood people. And we have strengths and possibilities and weaknesses and limitations. Don't never ever forget that. And he had to have his fun too. And cricket, he loved his cricket. And one of the reasons why he couldn't settle down himself and marry a woman is because he loved the people too much. That was his life work. He loved the people, not in the general, but in the particular. Anybody can say they love people in the general. The critical thing is to love in the particular. Because it is that love in the particular which has joys and pain. Because if a general love disappoints you, you shrug it off. But if it's a particular love, it's painful. But you only know the joy from a particular love. And in his case, he loved people in a particular manner. And though his defeat in 1990, when they gerrymandered Pebush constituency, he nevertheless would have learned lessons from that. That all politics is local. And you have to pay attention to what is happening on the ground. And he learned also the pain of defeat. Unless you have victory and defeat, you don't know what this thing is about. It makes you stronger when you turn a setback into an advance. Don't wallow in the setback. Turn it into an advance. I'm talking about Rosie, and his life. Rosie, we know the story that is well told, and Rosie told me about it too, how he left. He wanted to go and study agriculture. His father told me he had ambitions for him to help to run Hampstead. And Rosie also, in his youthful zest and love nature, wanted to do that too. He didn't know yet fully what the calling was ahead for him. And he wanted to go to study agriculture, which he went and did. And we know the story about how he had problems getting the student visa. He got on to John Diefenbaker, the Prime Minister. Can you imagine that? Remember, in those days, we didn't have this, You had these old phones, so you had to crank up. To get from Dominica to Canada to talk to somebody is a hell of a thing. To talk to the Prime Minister. It's an extraordinary story, Absolutely extraordinary. And of course, we know he went there, he did agriculture. And because the progressive conservatives were in power, and Diefenbaker was a progressive conservative, Rosie got linked up with the young conservatives. And he got to know a lot of people. In fact, at that time when Rosie was there with the young conservatives, most Caribbean people were looking at Pierre Trudeau, who was the rising star in the Liberal Party in Canada, who subsequently became Prime Minister. But Rosie acute as always in his understanding and observances, saw how Caribbean women who had gone up to work as domestics, how they were treated. How Native Indians, they were Aboriginal peoples, were treated. How black people generally were treated in Canada. And the conservatives, including the leader, the young conservative, Joe Clark, who subsequently became a Prime Minister, wouldn't address this question. And Rosie broke. In this phase in Canada, there are two persons of great influence in Rosie's life, and I want you to remember them. I want you to remember them here tonight. One is Alfonso Alfie Roberts of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The second is Leonard Tim Hector from Antigua and Barbuda. When Rosie finished his school in agriculture and he went to Montreal, Alfie Roberts was there and Tim Hector. Tim Hector was a brilliant student. Alfie Roberts, how many of you know about Alfie Roberts? Nobody? Well, here. Just as a matter of question, how many of you know about Walter Rodney? A little bit more. What about Sir Walter Raleigh? I believe many of you shame to put up your hand. You know Raleigh. You know Walter Raleigh more than Walter Rodney. I know Walter Raleigh more than more than Alfie Roberts. Alfie Roberts is the first man from the Windward and Leeward Islands to play Test cricket for the West Indies. Did you know that? In 1956. He went to New Zealand with the Test team. He played one Test match. He actually made the team while he was a schoolboy at Queen's Royal College in Trinidad. Everton Weeks had seen him in St. Vincent and said that this is a young man of real talent. And he was put into school in Trinidad, Queen's Royal College, one of the top schools. And at 25, he went there in New Zealand at 18. At 25, Alfie gave up the game to concentrate on matters of liberation. He was a scholar, a researcher, practically a one-man research team in Montreal, Alfie Roberts. And Rosie would have been fascinated with Alfie because of cricket. And remember, at this time, there is the civil rights movement in the United States with Martin Luther King and the more radical positions on civil rights by Malcolm X and by Stokely Carmichael. And Rosie got to know Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, who was originally from Trinidad. And Alfie Roberts introduced him to writings of national liberation. And it is in that phase in Rosie's life that he became a Pan-Africanist. And he became a revolutionary Democrat, socialist oriented. He told me the first time he read The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, he felt the scales falling off his eyes. Began to see the world more clearly. Fanon was a psychiatrist. He studied a black man from Martinique who studied in Paris and then went to Algeria to practice his profession and became a member of the liberation movement in Algeria, fighting for independence against the French. So Rosie got steeped in Pan-Africanism, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and these never left him. Never left him. Whatever adjustments he had to make in Dominica to take account of the peculiar nature of Dominican society and the economy, some probably even thought, well, he was going soft on certain things. No. Sometimes you have to stoop to conquer. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people are not mature enough to understand that. But he always kept his eyes on the ball. You see, your highest mountain peak in Dominica is what? Huh? Mont Diablotin. Yes, they taught me that in primary school. You ever climb it in a straight line? Huh? You're going to the top, you ever climb it in a straight line? You have to take zigs and you have to take zags. The important thing when you take a zig or a zag is not to go in a cul-de-sac, in a dead end. When you make a zig and a zag, you must be going to the mountaintop. And if you can't move something, you walk around it. This is what mature life and living teach you, and which you have to incorporate in your political praxis, both your theory and practice. A lot of people don't realize that. And as I said, there are many contradictions which are interconnected, and it's how they're resolved or muted as you go forward with progress. Took a while for some to understand Rosie. But don't worry about that. That's part of the testing. No. I joined with the comrades in the Dominica Labour Party and the government, demanding of the Canadian government to exonerate Rosie Douglas. He did 18 months in jail, not for what they charged him. He and I spoke about this a long time. And in fact, there were reports which showed, and he told me about that, agents provocateurs who helped to mash up the computer center at Sir George William and also set fire. But when Rosie was in jail, he didn't waste time in jail. He taught prisoners. He acted out the third limb of the 25th chapter of Matthew. Educated them. He wrote a report about prison conditions and recommended reforms in the Canadian prison system. And of course, when he came out, he went on a tour, explaining many things and seeking to build solidarity and unity between Caribbean people and African people and poor whites, working class, and also the indigenous people. The authorities say that he was a security risk, and they sent him back in chains. No, Rosie would tell me that even the most humiliating of things, Rosie will find humor. So I say, what you mean? The fellas, when they put you on the plane, they kept you in handcuffs. They didn't take off the handcuff. They said no. The fellas who took him on the plane. So, but it's a long journey. I say, what about the bathroom? He said, well, that's the problem. He said, when he say you want to go to the bathroom, the fella to come to him, these bathrooms on the plane narrow. You had two men jam up, a white man and a black man, a tall big black man, and he had to. You just have to picture the absurdity. When he came back, he met a Dominica which was in some political ferment. Dominica had already had associate statehood with Britain. In 1967, Leblanc, Edward Oliver Leblanc, the darling of the working class and supporters of the Labour Party, had led the party with distinction. And then he left. He just left in 1974. We know that Patrick John came to the fore. And then the talk was for independence. And Rosie came back and set up the Popular Independence Committee and brought a number of people, went all over Dominica and contributed greatly to that discussion. And asked, among other things, for and demanded that we have a non-executive president in Dominica and replace the Queen as the sovereign. And that happened. Nobody had anything against Elizabeth, but really, how can a queen in England be the Queen of Dominica? I mean, it's an absurdity, total absurdity. And Rosie was wrapped up with that ferment. And Patrick John did not lead well. And the Dominica Labour Party had internal differences, went to independence, and within a few months, after 1978, the government, there's a vote of no confidence in the government. Oliver Seraphin became interim prime minister. Mike, who had won in 1975 in Portsmouth under the DLP ticket, was the deputy prime minister. He was another extraordinary one. But we ain't talking about Mike tonight, talking about Rosie. Another time I could talk about Mike. And between 1976 and 1992, Rosie was seeking to define a path on the left and to see if he can have Dominica change its orientation in politics and in the economy. And remember, then banana was king, supported by preferences. And in Rosie's lifetime, he would have seen that in 1993, the banana preferences start to diminish to the point when he arrived in office, they were almost completely extinguished. And of course, the glory days of bananas are gone because of the falling off of the preferences as Britain joined the single market in Europe. And Rosie building links all the time. One, as we know, in 1985 in Pebush, and then he lost in 1990 when they gerrymandered the constituency. 1980, we began to see the regime of Eugenia. At a time, Eugenia Charles, at the time when Reagan and Thatcher were dominant in the world. And there was a right-wing revolution, and imperialism getting more and more confident. But yet contradictions in the international capitalist system and in the periphery like in Dominica. He lost in 1990 when the gerrymandering took place. And then very sadly, Mike died in 1992. And we know the story. Rosie became prime minister, and he became leader of the Labour Party, succeeded Mike in Portsmouth, and remained the MP for Portsmouth until he died in 2000. Rosie, until he died there. And when Rosie became leader of the DLP in 1992, as you know better than I do, Rosie was the principal critic of the Eugenia Charles government. In the period after 1983, well, if you go back a little earlier, in 1979, is a high water point for the progressive movement in the region. Maurice Bishop becomes head of the People's Revolutionary Government in Grenada. The revolution took place, but 4 years later, internal differences. The government fell, And the revolution collapsed, and Reagan invaded with Eugena's assistance and buried the remains of the revolution. And that period of conservative reaction emerged, and that Rosie had to operate in that context. I had to operate in that context. And Rosie, George Odleman, Tim Hector, and I, particularly in the post-1983 period, until he died, we worked very closely with one another. Rosie was close in this period to the Libyan government, well, Muammar Gaddafi. Rosie had been going through Africa quite a lot. And Rosie made a very important contribution in persuading Gaddafi to switch the Libyan support from the Pan-African Congress, which is a narrow political organization in South Africa, which in their constitution, only black people could have been members of the Pan-African Congress. And the African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, who was in jail, had a broader base and talked about involving all ethnicities in a democratic movement to build a free South Africa grounded in social democracy and socialist orientation. And Gaddafi began to support the African National Congress and assisted the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela in training persons in Libya and for providing economic support. Another Caribbean leader provided enormous support, decisive support, was Fidel Castro in sending troops to Angola to help to defend the independence of Angola, and took on the South African army at the Battle of Cuito Valley and defeated them. And it is this popular movement across the world, in which Rosie was part of, in supporting Mandela and the ANC, which eventually led to the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. Now, in that period, Rosie was closely associated with the Mataba. The Mataba is the political wing of the Libyan Jamahiriya under Gaddafi, which dealt with the political dimensions of external affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs dealt with the formal diplomatic stuff. So Rosie had, with the Mataba, had connections with liberation movements all over Africa and progressive forces elsewhere who were provided with support by the Libyan authorities. And he was critical in that particular period. You know, during that period, as Rosie got very popular, they were saying that he doesn't have responsibility. He's just flying all about, he's doing things, he getting money from Libya, he's a communist. You remember all the stories? Married, you got no responsibility. I remember one night I was telling my dear sister from Pebush the story today. But I was up in Pebush with Rosie on the platform, and Rosie's addressing the question very humorously about his unmarried status. He said he don't understand how freedom is on his case, that he ain't married, he ain't got no responsibility. He said, but Eugenia older than me and she ain't married either. And they make she prime minister. And then he proceeded to say, he said, I want to get married to a Dominican. And you know, sometimes Rosie's talking like this. You don't know whether he's playful, whether he's serious. He said, I want to get married to a Dominican woman. He said, but none of them want me. He said, I specifically want one from Pebush. And he said, I have asked, and they have agreed, Mary and Elizabeth, 2 women in Pebush, to choose a woman for me in Pebush and said, this is the woman you have to marry. And of course, the audience was just laughing. So when Rosie sat down back, he's sitting down next to me on the platform. I said, comrade, you serious about this thing? You put the question of holy matrimony in the hand of 2 women in Pebush? He said, don't bother about Ralph, man. He said, everybody here know Mary and Elizabeth have never agreed on anything in their life. And then the lesson, remember I started about solidarity and we mustn't have divisions. The lesson of the period 1979 to 1992, that period with the collapse of the Patrick John government until Rosie became leader in 1992. There were all kind of different factions of the Labour Party coming and going. You look around in St. Lucia, the divisions in the St. Lucia Labour Party caused the St. Lucia Labour Party to stay out of office for quite a long time. You look in St. Kitts, the divisions in the party between Denzil Douglas and Timothy Harris. The working people do not like divisions. They expect that we will have arguments and we could have quarrels and we could have differences. But you have to settle it inside of the Labour family. There's a lesson then, and there's a lesson now. When you leave the Labour family, it's a terrible thing. You're a traitor, you're a renegade, or you're a castaway. You must not leave the family. You stay in the family because it's solidarity that keeps making progress. That is the lesson. Oh, you get all kind of vanities. And nowadays, the vanities are multiplied because of this. But this remains fundamental. One of the reasons for the success of the Unity Labour Party in St. Vincent and Grenadines, in nearly 25 years since I'm Prime Minister, I've never fired a member of cabinet and none has ever resigned on me. If anybody playing the fool, I call you by me. If you're a man, I talk to you in language that if the Pope hear me, you'll excommunicate me. If it's a woman, I say, sister, I say, what happening? Tell me, talk to me. Talk to the comrade. You have to stay together. No. Interestingly, to see the practicality of Rosie in the next phase, 1992 to 19 to 2000. Rosie was when Rosie began to look for, after Eugenia resigned in 1990, and Brian Alleyne took over. And we know that Eugenia said publicly she didn't like Brian. You know, she said that publicly. She had a preference for Carbon or somebody else. No. Rosie saw the opportunity to have good and decent people from freedom come to labor. And particularly he looked to see the young freedomites from where he can get persons who have a progressive outlook, who are nationalists, to get them to come to labor. Because, you know, once you come into the bosom of labor, the social democracy of labor and the solidarity of labor will help to transform them and change them for the better. Now in 2000, you remember, well, in between, with all the confusion in labor, space was left for some other people to come, UWP. Remember that? Politics abhors a vacuum. If you have confusion, somebody else is going to come and take up some space, you know. Eh? Remember I telling you this? You can watch the history of it. And then in 2000, after you had a UWP government for 5 years, 1995, under Edison, who was my good friend, and we did some work together in Scope and with Bananas and the like, so too with Mike and Rosie. And then the election in 2000, Labour got 10, UWP got 9, and Sovereign, Charles Sovereign, who was then the leader of the party, the Freedom Party, they got 2 seats. And what is interesting, which is another lesson, the party led by a man who is supposed to be the most radical political figure who had gone mainstream in the period after, just before and after independence, Rosie Douglas, who was traduced as a communist by freedom, the worst things were spoken about him. But then it's that party and the remains of freedom, which was the most right-wing party historically in the period after independence, they came together to form a government. And this genius of Rosie Douglas has laid the foundation for the continued success from 2000 to right now for the Dominica Labour Party. The other thing I want to say to you, and there are people who I know in the midst of battle and those who move against my real close brethren and comrade, who is like a son to me, because my oldest son, who is 53, who is my Minister of Finance, is older than Roosevelt Skerritt. So Skerritt could be my son. So he's my comrade, but I'm like a father. And we have a wonderful relationship. The genius of Rosie was to have brought them together, brought all the various elements and laid the foundation. And Roosevelt Skerritt's skills have taken it to higher heights. No. In his period in government, his 8 months, Rosie took a whole set of initiatives. Of course, he went back to Canada triumphant because in May of 2000, because he said that he had predicted that he will go back as Prime Minister, and he went back as Prime Minister. A man who left in chains went back as Prime Minister. He who couldn't go in a bathroom without a security man with him, they give him the red carpet in 2000. After one time is the next. Solidarity. And Rosie was setting out to transform a colonial or amended colonial economy into a modern, competitive, many-sided post-colonial economy which was at once national, regional, and global. And looking for spaces even so much to want to deepen the relationships with Martinique and Guadeloupe and with France and with the European Union, which some people at the time didn't quite understand. But we live to see that Martinique and Guadeloupe and St. Martin are associate members of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. These are things, they happen before your very eyes, you know. I want to point something to you before your very eyes. You see, in 1980, amidst all the tumult and division of labor, the people of Dominica with great good sense say, listen, you see that confusion? Eugenia Charles and the DF, the Democratic Freedom, the Dominica Freedom Party, looks like the only one which can hold things for a while. And they went there for political stability and to see progress. And then confusion was happening after the resignation of Eugenia. And we see the problems in the UWP, and we see how Rosie brought them together. But watch this. And while Rosie and Pierre Charles played an important role between October 2000 and when he also died prematurely from a heart attack in 2004. Watch this. Dominica lost Eugenia through a resignation. Lost Mike in his early 50s. Brian Aline went to the court. Edison James loses government. Cabon died at sea. Rosie died. Pierre Charles died. Bananas collapsing. It is completely rational for the people of Dominica to have gone for a young man, Roosevelt Skerritt, to continue Rosie's legacy. It's not a mystery, you know, you just have to watch it. I'm sure the journalists would have seen all what I'm talking about. And we need to write more about it. We need to write more about it. I'll tell you something. And I'm sure that my brother Austria wouldn't mind me saying this. He says, okay, I can. I told him something about 4 or 5 years ago at lunch in Caracas. And I was there with a couple of comrades. I said, comrade, I have to tell you, I put my mouth in business and you lost the opportunity to be Prime Minister in Dominica, leader of the Labour Party. Austria was popular in the Dominica Labour Party, you know. And Roosevelt loved Austria. That's why he had him doing important jobs in his cabinet for all the time, and Austria did very, very well. But when, after Pierre Charles died, I called Roosevelt. I said, Roosevelt, Rosie had told me that you are the person who will succeed him, because Rosie expected he was going to do a good 10, maybe 15 years. The Lord give it and the Lord take it away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I called Roosevelt. I said, how is this thing going? He said, well, you know, Austria is my friend. He's the mature person and so on. I said, Roosevelt, Dominica has gone through too much tumult. They have this problem with bananas. We need a different kind of leadership to head it. I say, as good as my comrade Austria is, you have to make sure that your name is in the mix. And of course, Brother Austria himself recognized that. Labor in Dominica, labor in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, labor elsewhere, we are peculiar organizations. We have a collective wisdom which we draw upon. And we know the history very well, and we feel it. It's a noise in our blood, it's an echo in our bones. And we know when to make right decisions. And sometimes labor can be deceptive. Sometimes some fellas making a lot of noise in the opposition. Plenty noise. Pretending to have more support than they have, and labor people just going along and so on. They're waiting and they're waiting until the trump is sung. Just as Paul predicted in another context, the dead in Christ shall rise, and the others who are living will get wrapped up. It's the rapture. The labor family has this ability. It is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And when you knock on your neighbor door, all they say is labor. It is something which is incredible. It's existential to us, so long as we stay in solidarity and don't get divided. I want to hammer that because that is the lesson from Rosie, as how he brought people together in 2000. And even notice what happened. My brother Charles Saverin became president and had a distinguished career as president of Dominica. Left and right? Well, it depends where you have the center. Whether you're left or you're right, it depends on where the center is. That's how that definition takes place. Of course, Rosie used to spend a lot of time with me in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Eloise, my wife, who is a Dominican by descent, parents of a Dominican from the Harris family. And she would have been here, but to the fact she wasn't feeling the best. But she sends her greetings, and I have to convey the greetings. And Rosie came, and Mike, and Sister Pat. Sister Pat was principal of the school in the St. Joseph's Convents, a co-educational school in St. Vincent, in a rural community, Mariaqua. And as you know, they have a rule generally that they don't give their premises for any political activity. But when the leadership elections were coming in our party for who to succeed Vincent Beach, she said, you have to have the convention in my school. Of course, the bishop didn't like it, and she told the bishop, Ralph is a Roman Catholic. This is my school. You could advise me, but I'm running the school. He's going to be elected the party leader. I want it to take place here. He's going to be the first Roman Catholic Prime Minister. What you say about that? Then, just like with the labor, don't mess with the Romans, you know. There's a depth too. I know evangelicals, different ways to God, and I am an ecumenical person. But something happened. Sister Pat had a book she said she wanted to give me in the week before she died in an accident in Barbados. She contacted me, we spoke about each other, we had set up meetings, she busy, I busy, we missed the meetings. The title of the book is The Return of the Prodigal Son, by a priest who was living in Canada, man of great reputation as a theologian, Henri Nouwen, HenriNouwen. You can read that book. I advise you, published in 1996 or thereabouts. And Pat was determined, Sister Pat was determined to give me this book. But on the Friday when she was leaving for Barbados, she took the book with her. She drove past where the airport is, came on the perimeter of the western end of the city, came to the residence of the Prime Minister, and left the book. I wasn't there. She left it there. Just with the instruction, Ralph must read this book. And when I was reading the book, the Friday night, late, I got the news that Pat had died. She was in this accident. And from then until now, this thing always on my mind. Why did Sister Pat was so insistent that I get this book? She was some force not yet known to her knew that if I didn't get it then, I wouldn't get it again. What is this book about? This book is about, and I started at the beginning, and you would understand, I didn't explain the totality of our conversation. The morning when you went to the delegates convention of the DLP. The book speaks about the homecoming of the prodigal son. The homecoming to an all-powerful and all-forgiving God. He turns the story inside out. When we read the story about the prodigal son, and we see how he's in a distant land, and we all are in distant lands. And we're looking for love in this distant land. And we are finding it. Sometimes we have to eat for the hog eating. What happened to the prodigal son? But the important figure in that story is not the prodigal son, but the Father, who is all powerful and all forgiving. In the homecoming, and the only place you can find love is when you come home. And this love is a never fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is a love which is expressed daily, despite dissonances from time to time, by our people for one another. Something which holds us together as a progressive society. Think about it. You think Dominica could have made the progress without this sense of solidarity with one another, an elemental love which springs from our deepest longings, informed by faith and embracing hope? We lost so many leaders in Dominica. Bananas collapsed. Hurricane David, Hurricane Allen, Hurricane Maria, the global economic crisis. We are battered. COVID, occasional droughts, all the vagaries of climate change, the harshness of the external world. And through it all, we have survived and we have thrived. We have much to be thankful for. Much to be thankful for. And a leader like Roosevelt Skerritt was helped to take us through that period in Dominica. Do not underestimate any of that. Do not get carried away by vanities. To be sure, we all have complaints. We have grouses. And sometimes I know some in the Labour family, they get a feeling in their head that they like Samson. They want to bring the temple down on everybody's head. But if they remember the story with Samson properly, Samson brought the temple down on everybody's head, including his own. And when you bring it, when you divide yourself and you create confusion and you bring the temple down on everybody's head, including your own, the morning after, you say, oh God, what I do? Weeping and gnashing of teeth. No. We can't do that. Dominica, look at the 2025 Human Development Index report by the United Nations Development Program. There are 4 categories. Very high human development, medium, and low. Dominica, which has been battered in the way in which I've described it in many dimensions, is in the high category of human development. A person who is sent to university, give them a free education. There is a pothole in the last half a kilometer before their house. They drive in a SUV. They get the education free. But they're on Facebook. They can't vote Labour because of the pothole. They forget that the first thing that Labour did is to fill the pothole in your head. which made it possible, for you to go to the bank to get a mortgage for your house and for you to buy your SUV. Remember your satisfactions. Do not allow your dissatisfactions to overwhelm you. You allow your dissatisfactions to overwhelm you, you will live a miserable life. You will never, ever be satisfied. Because morning by morning, new mercies we see. All that we need, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness. Thank you very much.